Imagine for a moment that you are in a suffocating room in the city of St. Petersburg during the mid-19th century. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of fresh ink and cheap cigarette smoke. In front of you, a man with a broad forehead and a feverish gaze dictates words at an astonishing speed to a young stenographer. That man is Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of the titans of world literature, and what he is doing is not simply a creative exercise, but a desperate race for his own civil and literary survival. To understand the magnitude of the work titled The Gambler, we must first dive into the shifting sands of its author's life, because this book was not born from contemplative calm, but from the most absolute urgency. Dostoevsky had signed a predatory contract with an unscrupulous publisher named Stelovsky. The terms were brutal. If the writer did not deliver a complete novel by November 1st, 1866, he would lose the rights to all his past and future works to the publisher for 9 years. He had less than a month to write a masterpiece from scratch while simultaneously working on Crime and Punishment. It was under this almost inhuman pressure that The Gambler was born, dictated in just 26 days to Anna Grigorievna, who would later become his wife. This urgency is felt on every page, in every paragraph, and in the frantic pace of a narrative that seems to accelerate as the characters approach the abyss. To understand this historical context, we must look beyond the biographical anecdote and observe the social structure of Europe at that time. We are in a period where the Russian aristocracy was living through a deep identity crisis, oscillating between the desire to imitate the refined manners of Paris and the harsh reality of a crumbling feudal economy. The setting of the novel is a fictional city called Roulettenberg, a name that is in itself a statement of intent by the author. Roulettenberg represents the microcosm of European decadence, a place where time stands still and the only valid law is the erratic movement of a small ivory ball on a spinning wheel. It is a German spa town where characters of various nationalities gather, each carrying their own prejudices and despairs, all united by the invisible thread of greed and chance. The atmosphere is one of superficial elegance that hides absolute moral rot, and it is here where our protagonist, Alexei Ivanovich, becomes the lens through which we will dissect human nature. The plot centers on Alexei, a young tutor working for the family of a retired Russian general. But this general is not the authority figure his rank suggests, but a ruined man living on appearances, anxiously waiting for the death of his elderly aunt in Moscow, whom they affectionately call grandmother, to inherit a fortune that will settle his debts with a French gentleman named de Griot. The central conflict is not just financial, but deeply emotional and psychological. Alexei is madly in love, or perhaps we should say obsessed, with Polina Alexandrovna, the general's stepdaughter. Polina is a complex, enigmatic, and often cruel character who uses Alexei as a pawn in her own games of power and spite. This dynamic leads us to one of the most fascinating points of Dostoevsky's narrative, the intrinsic connection between the game of chance and the game of love. For Alexei, winning at roulette and winning Polina's heart are two sides of the same coin. Both depend on a stroke of luck, on a total surrender to destiny that annuls one's own will. The development of events reaches its climax with the unexpected arrival of grandmother in Roulettenberg. Instead of receiving news of her passing, the family encounters an old woman full of vigor and curiosity who, far from being the savior of the family finances, allows herself to be seduced by the glow of the casinos. This twist is masterful because it subverts all the expectations of both the characters and the reader. Grandmother, who represented stability and Russian tradition, falls into the same spiral of self-destruction as the others, losing astronomical sums in a matter of days. This event acts as a catalyst that strips the characters of their masks of respectability. The general sinks into despair, de Griot flees as he sees the money vanish, and Alexei is finally pushed to play for himself, no longer for Polina, but for the pure intoxication of risk. But to understand this in depth, we must look toward the profound deconstruction of the themes that Dostoevsky weaves into the story. The concept of chance is not treated simply as a game mechanic, but as an ontological category, a way of being in the world. In the philosophy of the time, and especially in Dostoevsky's vision, gambling represents a rebellion against rationalist logic and determinism. By betting, the individual defies the laws of probability and seeks a moment of transcendence where a single second can change the course of an entire life. Modern psychologists who study gambling addiction often cite this work as a precise description of what we call today the near-miss effect, where the gambler's brain receives a dopamine hit both when winning and when being on the verge of winning. Alexei does not seek money for the sake of money itself. In fact, he often despises wealth accumulated in an orderly bourgeois fashion. What he seeks is vertigo, the feeling of being alive on the razor's edge. This inevitably leads us to another crucial aspect, the analysis of national identities. Dostoevsky uses The Gambler to perform a fierce and often satirical critique of different European cultures. For the author, the Russian is a being capable of the greatest heights and the most abject falls, an individual dominated by excess and passion who despises the cautious saving of the Germans or the hypocritical etiquette of the French. The character of the Englishman, Mr. Astley, acts as a counterpoint of cold observation and stable morality, but even he seems fascinated by the chaos emanating from the Russians. This distinction is not purely anecdotal, it reflects a deep concern about Russia's place among the nations. Gambling becomes a metaphor for the Russian economy of the time, dependent on external flows and strokes of luck, lacking the solid industrial base that the author viewed with a mixture of envy and contempt in the rest of Europe. The deconstruction of the figure of Alexei Ivanovich reveals to us the prototype of the underground man, that recurring character in Dostoevsky who is excessively conscious of his own misery and who finds a masochistic pleasure in his own degradation. Alexei knows that gambling is destroying him. He knows that his obsession with Polina is toxic, and yet he throws himself toward it with a suicidal will. This is where we must apply a deep psychological magnifying glass. The relationship between Alexei and Polina is a study of power and submission. In a famous scene, Polina asks Alexei if he would really kill someone if she ordered him to, and he responds with a terrifying sincerity that he would. This readiness for the annihilation of the self is what defines the Dostoevskian gambler. He is not a seeker of pleasure, he is a seeker of intensity. For him, nothingness is preferable to the mediocrity of a planned life. It is vital to analyze the symbolism of money in the novel. In the universe of Roulettenberg, money has lost its function as a medium of exchange for real goods to become a pure abstraction. The piles of gold coins on the green felt our potential energy. They are materialized dreams and nightmares that can disappear with a breath of air. Dostoevsky, who suffered firsthand the humiliation of poverty and the persecution of creditors, endows money with an almost mystical quality. Money is the only tool that allows a nobody like Alexei to look a French aristocrat in the eye and feel like his equal, or even his superior, even if only for a fleeting moment. The deconstruction of money as a status tool allows us to see how 19th century society was already transitioning toward a financial capitalism where reality was becoming increasingly speculative. But to understand this in depth, we must look at the narrative technique. The use of the first person is fundamental. By reading Alexei's diary, we are trapped in his distorted subjectivity. We are not objective observers, but accomplices in his delirium. Narratology teaches us that an unreliable narrator, such as an addict in full crisis, forces the reader to read between the lines to discover the truth that the protagonist himself tries to hide from himself. Alexei justifies his losses as bad luck and his small victories as proof of his personal genius, a cognitive bias that we have all experienced to a lesser extent. This technique immerses the reader in a state of constant anxiety, replicating the gambler's racing heart in front of the roulette wheel. The work also explores the idea of time in a revolutionary way. In Roulettenberg, time is not linear but circular and spasmodic. There are periods of unbearable waiting followed by bursts of action where weeks of fortune are decided in seconds. This altered perception of time is characteristic of states of addiction and trauma. Dostoevsky manages to convey the feeling that the future does not exist. Only the eternal now of the next bet exists. This leads us to consider the current relevance of the gambler in our 21st century. Although we no longer frequent luxury casinos dressed in black tie, the psychological mechanisms that Dostoevsky described with such precision are more present than ever in our daily lives. We live in the era of the gamification of existence. Social media platforms are designed under the same principles as slot machines, using variable rewards to keep us hooked to the screen, waiting for that next like or notification that acts as our digital stroke of luck. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed what the Russian author sensed through observation and suffering, that the human brain is extremely vulnerable to uncertainty and that the anticipation of a reward is often more powerful than the reward itself. If we observe the world of modern finance with high-frequency trading, cryptocurrencies, and speculative investments, we see a globalized version of Roulettenberg. The modern investor seeking quick wealth through complex algorithms is not very different from grandmother betting her thousands of rubles on a random number. Both are caught in the illusion of control, believing they can decipher a pattern in chaos. Even in popular culture and entertainment, we see the legacy of the gambler. From movies exploring the gambler's psyche to the very structure of many modern video games that include loot boxes or chance mechanics to monetize the user experience. The concept of total loss as a form of liberation, which Alexei experiences toward the end of the novel, is a recurring theme in existentialist cinema and contemporary literature. Dostoevsky was the first to map with such cartographic detail that dark territory where desire becomes a chain and freedom is confused with self-destruction. The connection with modern problems also extends to the crisis of grand narratives and the loss of meaning. When traditional values fade away, as happens to the Russian aristocracy in the novel, chance fills the void. In a world that seems to lack a clear purpose, roulette offers an immediate answer, however cruel it may be. It is a simplified form of destiny. This human need to find order in the random is what makes us return time and again to the gaming tables, or in our case, to the infinite possibilities offered by technology to bet our time and attention. But to understand this in depth, we must look toward the philosophical conclusion of the work. The end of the novel is one of the most melancholy and realistic in the history of literature. Alexei, after having won a fortune and lost it almost immediately, finds himself alone in a foreign city, working as a servant to survive and saving every spare coin to play again. His final line, tomorrow it will all be over, is the ultimate lie that every addict tells themselves. It is the procrastination of salvation. Dostoevsky does not offer us a happy ending or a simplistic moral. He shows us that the gambler's circle is difficult to break because it's not just about money, but about a way of perceiving reality where tomorrow is always a promised paradise that never arrives. This work is ultimately a treatise on human freedom and its limits. Alexei believes he is free when he bets, but in reality, he is a slave to his own impulses and to a mechanic he cannot control. True freedom, Dostoevsky would suggest in his later, more mature works, resides in responsibility and connection with others, something the gambler has sacrificed on the altar of chance. However, there is a strange nobility in his persistence, a refusal to accept a gray and mediocre life that, although mistaken in its direction, shows the indomitable strength of the human spirit even when it heads toward its own end. Reflecting on the gambler as a mirror of our own condition, we realize that we are all, to some extent, players in the great casino of life. We bet our emotions on relationships, our time on professional careers, and our beliefs on ideologies that promise a better future. Dostoevsky's mastery lies in reminding us that behind the facade of reason and progress, that primitive impulse for risk still beats, that fascination with the abyss that can lift us to the highest peaks or sink us into the deepest darkness. Reading this novel is not just an aesthetic exercise, but an introspective journey that forces us to ask ourselves what we are really betting and if we are prepared to lose it all. The figure of Dostoevsky dictating these pages while his own life hung by a thread gives the work an authenticity that few books possess. It is a testament to how art can emerge from the most adverse circumstances and how a man can transform his own weakness and vices into a source of universal knowledge. The Gambler is, at once, a personal confession, a social satire, a psychological study, and a prophecy about the course of modernity. Through the story of Alexei, Polina, and grandmother, we are offered a dazzling vision of the passions that rule us and the fragility of our certainties. It is important to note that, despite its dark tone, the novel contains moments of biting humor and almost comic situations that highlight the absurdity of human existence. Grandmother's arrival at the casino and her transformation from a severe matron into a frantic gambler is one of the funniest and at the same time most tragic sequences in Russian literature. This balance between the tragic and the comic is what allows the philosophical depth of the text to be accessible and vibrant, preventing it from falling into absolute pessimism. Dostoevsky invites us to laugh at our own madness, even as he shows us its devastating consequences. As we close this analysis, we must look back to the young Anna Grigorievna, the stenographer who helped bring these words to life. Her presence in the creation of the novel is symbolic. She represents the order, patience, and love that would finally save Dostoevsky from his own fate as a gambler. While in the fiction, Alexei loses himself in the eternal tomorrow of the roulette wheel, in reality, the author found through this work the discipline necessary to overcome his debts and dedicate himself to writing the great literary cathedrals that were The Brothers Karamazov or The Idiot. Thus, the gambler becomes a bridge between the man who suffers and the artist who transcends, between the chaos of addiction and the order of literary creation. The deconstruction of this work leaves us with a disturbing question that resonates long after the reading is finished. In a world where everything seems subject to laws, algorithms, and predictions, how much space do we leave for the unexpected, for pure risk, for that moment when the ivory ball decides our destiny? Dostoevsky's The Gambler reminds us that despite all our attempts to domesticate chance, there will always be a part of us that yearns for the vertigo of the bet, that spark of madness that makes us human in the face of the cold logic of the universe. This is the enduring lesson of Roulettenberg, a lesson we continue to learn every time we face the unknown with the hope that maybe this time the chosen number will be the right one. We thus reach the end of this journey through the depths of the human psyche and the gaming tables of 19th century Europe. We have explored the urgencies of a cornered author, the decadence of a social class, the complex psychology of addiction, and the surprising connections of this story with our hyper-technological present. Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Gambler remains a lighthouse that illuminates our own shadows, reminding us of the beauty and the danger of our freedom. We hope that this deep analysis has allowed you to rediscover the work from a new perspective and that the words of the Russian genius continue to resonate within you like the persistent echo of a wheel that never stops spinning. Thank you very much for joining me in this literary exploration. It has been a pleasure to share these reflections on one of the most vibrant and necessary texts in world literature.